I had never really thought about the fact that big companies need that too. I thought surely giant companies, Fortune 50s, Fortune 100s, they must know how to do this because otherwise how could it be so big? Turns out that they're actually pretty bad at it. So that led to the founding of Relativity Sciences, a company I had for 14 years. And we did innovation, entrepreneurship, and customer intimacy for Fortune 500s.
Welcome to EIR Live, where we dive into the lives and lessons of entrepreneurs in residence. I'm Ilya Tabakh, together with my co-host Terrence, ready to bring you closer to the heartbeat of the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. Every episode, we explore the real stories behind the ideas, successes, setbacks, and everything in between. For everyone from aspiring EIRs to seasoned pros, EIR Live is your gateway to the depth of the entrepreneurial journey and bringing innovative insights into the broader world. Check out the full details in the episode description, subscribe to stay updated, and join us as we uncover what it takes to transform visions into ventures. Welcome aboard. Let's grow together.
Man, what an incredible episode with Dan. Dan, the man, the Kevin Bacon of EIRs, and I think that he really lived up to that. And frankly, I learned way more about the number of EIR opportunities that this guy had compared to what I actually thought when we brought him on the podcast. So much wisdom, over 40 plus years that you just can't read in books sometimes, right? At this level that Dan has outlined for us. But I have many more thoughts, man, and I'm long-winded. What do you think about it, Ilya?
Yeah, man, it's crazy. I mean, he's a common node between the two of us, right? You guys work together, and I kept running into him in kind of the climate tech ecosystem. The cool thing for me is, I've talked to Dan a couple times, including the episode, and we just have so many similarities. And it was cool as I saw you sort of picking up on some of the, he mentioned a little bit just in passing, kind of aviation and liking airplanes, and you were all over that. For me, he got started, his first project was getting started at 10. I was doing stuff when I was, before I was 10. As to your point, everybody's starting stuff. Then he was in methane and, kind of biosustainability stuff. And that was kind of the first chapter of my career. And so there's just crazy, like, as you pull on all these threads, there's just like, oh yeah, that's awesome. I'm interested in that. I've done that. And, I think it's crazy that he's a common node between us, just there in the network.
And it makes it so interesting because, Dan is one of those people that he's a true definition of a translator, right? And he's a great translator because he's seen and been exposed to multiple things, not just in climate, not in clean energy, but in biofuels and other things that in woodworking and chopping down things, flying planes. I mean, the layered sort of person you become to that sort of exposure in the different companies and ventures and the people you advise or consult along the way, it just it really shined through a lot in the episode. How he can go from talking about aviation to clean energy to a whole nother thing. And honestly, what I really admire about Dan is that his ability to give back. Yes, he's talked a lot about his positions as EIRs, but if you look at the theme of a lot of those positions, it was helping the next generation of leaders and entrepreneurs at universities and on campuses think through how do you actually build a business when you don't come from this background traditionally. He talked a lot about scientists, right? And wanting to work with those sort of people and give them the business and commercialization skills. So, for me, man, I just think so many different gems in this episode that people can take away from how do you give back and pay it forward while you still build. And I think he's a good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, 230 companies advised and sort of been involved in more broadly, 16 companies founded or been involved from kind of the ground floor. You can't compete with that level of experience. And what's crazy is, as to your point, he's just kind of pulling out gems left and right. You bring up something, he's like, oh yeah, that's like that time 25 years ago or 30 years ago and I'm like, yeah, well, that's right. What it is. So yeah, man. Well, yeah, let's jump into it and then let everybody else hear. But it's crazy the amount of sort of knowledge and breadth of vision we were able to engage in.
No doubt about it. I feel very honored to do this sort of work and interview people like Dan, and we're going to be doing many more of them. So let's get into it and let the people hear it.
All right. Well, I said super excited last time, but I guess I got to add a super, super excited because this really is exciting to have Dan Goodman on the podcast with us. Dan may just be the Kevin Bacon of entrepreneurs in residence, and we'll get to why I think that. But as I was starting to talk to EIRs and looking at a lot of deep tech startups, Dan actually popped up a couple times in the advisor page and things like that. And I haven't run into anybody else yet that's sort of all over the place. And so it'd be fun as we kind of get down the episodes here to see, how many degrees of separation folks have from Dan to, prove our theory. But super excited to have Dan on the podcast. Dan has an amazing background, so much so that we had to sort of put it in buckets a little bit. But maybe, Dan, I'd ask you a little bit to maybe give us your early background and kind of how you got started with innovation and entrepreneurship, and then we can kind of dive into it from there.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, guys. It's really exciting to be here with you. So I started my first company, I think, when I was 10 years old, fixing pinball machines. Ended up, doing that for about 15 years, had federal contracts and about 500 customers in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Went and got a electrical engineering degree at University of Maryland. And along the sort of pinball path, did some inventing around adaptive devices for people with disabilities. So invented a pinball machine you could play with your breath, eyelashes, teeth, or toes, that got used for traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury rehab around the country. And also a intraoral computer control device for quadriplegics. You could move a mouse with your tongue, things like that. Then, I ended up starting some other companies. I've now founded or co-founded 16 companies over the last 53 years. Through my sort of interest in renewable energy, a lot of those companies were clean tech, climate tech kinds of things. And I'll get back to that because that's sort of what I'm focused on now. But after, I think, 5 or 6 companies, I started thinking about, inventing and building the company, doing the sales and marketing. It's a long road to go through that whole process. So I got the idea that maybe licensing a technology from somebody else might be sort of a shortcut. So I ended up taking a course at NIH. They have a grad school there called the Foundation for the Advanced Education of the Sciences. Took a tech transfer course. One of the speakers was the University of Maryland tech transfer director. So I went up to him afterwards and volunteered and said, I'd love to learn about how tech commercialization works. I'd be happy to volunteer and do some industry deals for you, look at the portfolio of licensed technologies, bring a little bit of business perspective to your operations there. So I was the founding entrepreneur in residence, as it were, at the University of Maryland College Park's tech transfer office. That was my first tech transfer experience.
Hey, Dan, of your 16 companies, how many of them had you done before kind of the first EIR? Kind of 50 years, 16 companies, that's really dense, but I'm curious just kind of the, what frequency and how much experience you had before you kind of dove into the EIR side.
I think it was 6.
Okay. And a follow-up question to that, Dan, I always see a thread in serial entrepreneurs' background, which is they started something when they were younger. Doesn't matter what it was. Pinball machine company, lemonade stand, they sold something with their dad, but they had some early exposure to, the entrepreneurial process and journey, even if they didn't know it. And I see that thread as well in your background. Another thing that I want to call out is that the will to raise your hand to do something, even when, it wasn't money involved, right? Having the will to actually go to the event, learn something, walk up to the person afterwards, because you could have left, like probably half the room did, So, but the entrepreneurial spirit in you said, I'm going to go raise my hand and figure out how I can get involved. And that led to your first entrepreneur in residence role as the founding EIR at the University of Maryland, which I think is fascinating. So I don't want to let that thread go from the initiating, raising your hand, doing something early stages, and that exposure is also super important. That led to, your first sort of EIR gig. So talk to us about you becoming the founding EIR, right, at the University of Maryland. You're in this role now. It's day one. What is Dan doing on day one at the University of Maryland? How are you starting to build a foundation for other EIRs in the future that will come into the University of Maryland? What was your job there?
Well, let me answer that in one sec, but I want to say something about what you just mentioned, which was volunteering. I coach young folks to volunteer as much as they can in something that interests them, because, showing up every day, being competent, doing what you're asked, getting the job done makes you invaluable. So if you're looking for a job, or even if you're, more senior, and exploring something new, just volunteering seems to be a really underused, underthought about vector into doing something interesting that you like. The other thing that you mentioned was an exposure to entrepreneurship. And that I was lucky in that my family, back as far as we know, have all been entrepreneurs. So I think you grow up thinking about your work life from what you hear around the dining room table. And, my father started his own business. My grandfather started one. My great-grandfather started one that we know about. So that early exposure was, I think, really important in my thinking about the world and what I could do in it. At Maryland, day one, I spent actually several months, thumbing through the database of technologies, because part of my rationale for taking that role was, I'd like to spin something out. I'd like to find a technology that I could run with. But in the meantime, there were over 1,000 at the time. So that took quite a long time. But I also was learning about, how commercialization works at universities, meeting with faculty, talking to the lawyers, looking at the past deals and seeing how they were structured. So I did that for some months before I started trying to help them reach out to industry with technologies that weren't being actively commercialized. One of the secrets of university tech commercialization is that the staff has very little time. It's often just like 4 or 5 days to get acquainted, accustomed to a technology, understand the market space, and then try and go out and find licensees. And before they have to move on, because the flow of disclosures about innovations that are so much exceed the capacity of the staff to deal with them. So that I was trying to fill in and help with that.
That's incredible. And just a follow-up question to that, Dan, can you tell people why tech transfer is even important to universities? Why would they want to license their technology out to somebody? Can you talk to people about that very quickly?
Yeah, there was a congressional act called the Bayh-Dole Act. I forget the date, but I think it was the early 80s, mid 80s perhaps, where Congress decided that the federal dollars that were given to companies in forms of grants, and universities in forms of grants, should be dual use, right? They should be not just for academic knowledge creation, but they should help the economy and the tax base and the employment base for the U.S. by creating companies. So they had a mandate, if they had taken any federal money, to then commercialize that technology. So that was the impetus, but it has since grown into an engine of economic development. And universities often grow their regional economies by starting companies that then land nearby, and then create a virtual cycle of goodness in terms of more students coming in, more tax revenue for the region, more employment, more vibrancy in the local economy. So it's good all around, and it's something that is I think MIT was one of the first to really dig into it. but it's now very, very commonplace.
Just curious. So I talked to a lot of EIRs, especially at universities, and there's sort of a whole spectrum of how much structure and how much kind of thought folks had put in before kind of inviting an EIR. And, I sort of want to pull this on question on a couple of your EIR roles, but generally, was there a lot of kind of thought on what you would do and how the university would benefit when you came in, or was it more open-ended? And kind of how did folks think about that?
So initially the tech transfer office at Maryland, they never had one before. And I sort of proposed the idea, and they were like, sure, fine. We're not paying you. Extra help is great. And it's
right.
often like that. I went off and did a short stint at George Mason University as EIR, and that was helping faculty think about commercialization. Came back to Maryland, and I actually was EIR across different divisions of Maryland for a span of 22 years. So I went from, I licensed in technology out of the tech transfer office and spun up a company. Then moved over to the business school, got recruited by them to the Dingman Center for Entrepreneurship, which was one of the initial university entrepreneurship centers. Then moved up to the EIR Emeritus at the business school, Swiss School of Business, across the whole enterprise. Then got recruited by the vice president of research and helped him and the president sort of understand commercialization and entrepreneurship for a few years. Became the research development lead for the Lockheed Martin relationship between Lockheed and the university, which was the first sort of giant blanket agreement that a university had done with Lockheed. Then went back to the business school and was in the EIR for executive education, doing training for companies outside the university. After that, I actually moved to Columbia University as executive in residence, helping faculty and postdocs spin companies out. And now I'm at MIT as an advisor for their proto ventures. So I've had this sort of winding path through universities. So that's been sort of one track of my EIR experience.
So let me pull on the thread, Dan, because I love to find the through line. You were EIR, and I think I just want to underscore this for people, is that there is a residence for EIR when they go places. Even inside of a university, your residence is the school that you're catering to, if you will. And Dan has had the privilege to go across the School of Business, Engineering, and almost every other division you can think of, right, that matters. And a lot of them matter, right, at Maryland. So, but I don't want to lose the thread of he did a quick stint at George Mason, right? And then he went to Columbia, and then he's at MIT. Can you give me a quick, what led to you taking the EIR role at Mason, right? And what made you go back to Maryland? And how did that lead to you getting the role at Columbia?
Yeah, they're pretty disjoint. There really isn't a this
no,
happened, A
it.
happened, then B, then C. I somehow met the director of tech transfer at George Mason, and she said, I'm putting together a little group of EIRs to help advise faculty, because we're just sort of starting to think about that kind of role. So that was fairly short. I think that was a year and a half. But it was concurrent with Maryland. And then Columbia came about through a mutual connection with the executive director there, who suggested, my son was actually going to Columbia at the time. He said, next time you're up visiting your son, go see the executive director. He's a friend of mine. That guy offered me a role there, an executive in residence, which was fantastic, amazing. I had the whole physical sciences portfolio to deal with. And some amazing stuff coming out of there. And then the MIT thing came just through LinkedIn. They came looking for me.
I just love the thread of, I think I want to pull out the themes and some of the things that I see. Then one is relationships matter, friendships matter. And these are relationships that people build over years, decades. And, those relationships is not the only thing that matters. It's also how do you, combine the relationship with the value you can add to an organization or a place, and people will find you. They will seek you out. They will recruit you into the role. So, I don't want to lose the thread of Dan had the skill, but also the relationships matter, and that is a skill that you would need to pull on as an EIR because you're pulling so many threads as a translator. And Ilya, I'll pass it back to you, but I wanted to make sure we give the people that winding road.
No, that's great. Well,
Great.
and Dan's already talked about kind of being an entrepreneur, a founder, an EIR. He hasn't talked about being an innovation consultant yet, but that's sort of an interesting perspective. Maybe spending a little bit of time on kind of what you found out about, trying to get larger organizations and things like that to be innovative, because that's, a lot of EIRs, especially on the corporate side, unlike the university and things like that, have to sort of build a new category of muscles. Everybody is doing their chest, then they got to work on their back. And so there's not nearly as much expertise there. So maybe if we could talk about that, and then I got a couple more questions after that for you.
Yeah, so at the University of Maryland, Northrop Grumman came to the university. They're one of the sponsors of various engineering things. And one of the vice presidents came and said, hey, we're having a lot of trouble innovating. We're feeling very calcified. It's difficult to make decisions, and people are not taking risks. And have you got somebody that could help us sort that out? And they sent them to me. I ended up embedded at Northrop Grumman for 8 years as a consultant, and part of that time they called me an EIR. But that, I'd already coached and mentored and consulted for dozens and dozens of startups. I had never really thought about the fact that big companies need that too. I thought surely giant companies, Fortune 50s, Fortune 100s, they must know how to do this, because otherwise how could they be so big? Turns out that they're actually pretty bad at it. So that led to the founding of Relativity Sciences, a company I had for 14 years. And we did innovation, entrepreneurship, and customer intimacy for Fortune 500s. I had a crew of about 10 people that worked for me, and we did workshops, training, coaching, consulting, embedding with those companies and helping them take the innovative ideas that they already had and trying to get them over the finish line to get to revenue. Companies had a lot of trouble with that. They'd say, well, we spent millions of dollars on ideation. Maybe they had an ideation consultant come in, and they had this portfolio now of concepts, but and they want to innovate at the C-suite because they go, there's a 15-year-old in their basement someplace who's going to eat our lunch if we don't start innovating, right? The world is changing. We need to start getting fast and lean and thinking about innovation, and they just struggle with it. And once they did the ideation, they had a lot of trouble moving those things through to completion. So we started doing that. I would embed one of my staff or myself with the company. We teach them about customer discovery, about business model canvas, about a lot of the skills of entrepreneurship that convey to entrepreneurship. And a lot of those were interpersonal skills, communication, pitching, active listening, empathy, things that you really need to be good at to be a successful entrepreneur. And some of the lessons there were that the C-suite wanted these things, but the middle tier and front line would resist, and there'd be corporate antibodies that would try and stop these kinds of innovations from happening because those levels were not incentivized to make those things happen, right? If it takes more time or cost resources to do those things, that's not how middle managers got paid. So we had to work a lot with the C-suite on communicating the mindset of innovation and how important it was for the success of the company for this to be successful, and then getting the C-suite to flow down metrics that would make folks incentivized to actually help with this rather than fight against it.
Yeah, I actually find a couple of things. I think part of it is the lack of incentives and metrics, but I think also a lot of organizations are set up to manage risk, right? And if you're doing something new that you don't have a idea of how it's going to play out, and your sort of scorecard is for revenue or earnings delivery for the quarter or half year, that's just sort of a risk to execution. And so it may be that by practicing sort of good execution discipline, right, you're kind of focusing on the things that you know and understand and can sort of stand behind. And often that's not the new things. The other thing is it sort of hits me that, you're kind of describing the translator role of an entrepreneur in residence, right? A lot of the things we're talking about, to me, I'm sure to Terrence are, sort of, yeah, that makes sense. I did it, when I did this company, when I was in this role. There's by sort of the chaotic nature of the trajectory of the career, right? You've seen pieces, you've been kind of in the trenches. And so a lot of the, startups don't have a choice. They're always intimate with their clients and customers. Otherwise, they don't survive.
Right.
And so just some of these things are interesting to sort of see how you kind of translate. And then I think your point about, organizationally thinking about if the board level wants it, the C-suite wants it, ultimately you have to be aware of the organization and sort of the mechanics within a bigger company to see how do you kind of get everybody to row in the same direction. Because large companies are amazing in that they have a lot of resources and a lot of surface area in the marketplace that they're in and all kinds of other things, but it's very hard to get them to act in a coordinated fashion. And, culture, all of these big squishy things start to kind of be important considerations there. So it's cool that you're, sort of touching at the interfaces of some of those. I think this is maybe a whole other conversation, but just wanted to kind of highlight that, a lot of the things that I hear you saying in passing are really sort of the key for, innovation as a function actually leading to contributing to meaningful kind of line items on the P&L. Because going from that idea to, hey, we have a new $1 billion business or, a new thing that's driving earnings for the company for the next X years, that takes a lot of these things that, seem like they shouldn't be as much of an issue as they are, in my experience, at least.
Yes. And I'll add on to that I think it's so fascinating with corporates, like you said, Ilya, that you said they manage risk. And in many ways, that's what entrepreneurship is, right? You're managing risk, right, on the least amount of capital and resources that you can find to get to the next phase, to see another day, right? And it's so fascinating to me that large corporates or big organizations are really good at managing risk internally to their corporate sort of structure. But when it comes to building something new, right, finding their startup DNA again, right, which is how they got started, for whatever reason, they don't want to take those risks anymore. They don't want to manage those risks. They only want to manage the risk that keeps the core intact, which I think is very interesting. And I think the second piece, which I've seen in every EIR role that I've been in, and I've been in 3 of them, which is the incentives, right? You just can't incentivize the top and not the middle and not the bottom. You need the people at the bottom to be the infrastructure to your company building the new thing. And if you don't want to pay them or incentivize them to do so because you don't want them to make more money than you, I don't know if that's a good reason, right? So, I just wanted to comment a little bit on those things. I know you've seen it, Ilya, Dan, you've seen it multiple times. So just wanted to pull on that thread as well.
That's an excellent point, and I've seen that happen a lot where, that salary differential that you might incentivize a startup person inside your company with scares some of the upper management. But I think one of the major factors that I saw in limiting big companies' abilities to be entrepreneurial is the fact that they've sort of filtered out in the HR function. They've filtered out anybody that hasn't flowed through a very sort of standard career path to fit the job description that they're posting. So if you've done entrepreneurial things, that doesn't look good to the HR folks, right? They
right.
kind of screen those out, which is one of the reasons why the vacuum exists for EIRs to step into these kinds of roles, because they don't have a lot of people inside who've done entrepreneurial things. So when they have an initiative that they want, an innovation initiative that's trying to move forward, and they're trying to find staff to lead it, there's often nobody there. So anyway, that gives guys like us something to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's funny is so many different kind of experiences and so many different roles. I always like to, and then we've kind of like to ask folks the question of, what would you tell kind of your past self now that they knowing what you know? Because it's amazing that you can kind of distill insights and experiences from all kinds of different touch points across your career. You're saying, in more than 50 years founding companies and doing all these things. What would you tell past Dan from kind of some of these insights you've gained?
There's three things that I think I might tell my younger self. One is, what's now common practice is customer discovery. So I invented some things. I had an engineering company for about 15 years. And some of those were products that I had dreamed up, but didn't do any customer discovery and ended up spending lots of money, lots of time making things that nobody wanted. In part because, they were technically interesting and challenging. So it was fun for me as an engineer, but that's a terrible way to decide what to build. So customer discovery would be one. The other would be, vet partners better. People that you're going to go into business with, just do a deeper dive than I did as a younger guy, in terms of their work styles, their desires, what it is they really want out of that partnership. And, to be a detective and figure out, how they behaved and treated prior folks that they worked with. I think that would have been useful. And then I think the third is just not to worry as much, right? And not, maybe not get so excited about the thing when things are going great and not get so unhappy when things are going badly, because really life is both long and short, but, it's hardly ever worth the worry.
Yeah, it's it's really hard. When I coach and talk to entrepreneurs, I remind them that this is probably not the last deal you're working on.
Yeah.
Right. Because even in like university commercialization, everybody gets so laser focused on squeezing the last drop of water out of the turnip, and some folks are personality or whatever. That's just kind of how they focus. But it's sort of, I don't know what else other than sort of the benefit of time gives you that perspective of life as both short and long, right? But I think that's actually like a really critical, part of the reason why I've talked to some of my VC friends that they like to invest in second and third time founders is, some of that you can't learn, or it's much harder to learn from everybody else because, humans aren't exactly the most exquisite listeners. And so when somebody tells you that this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, you're like, oh, that sounds bad. And, somebody's having a flashback in their mind, very different experience for them, right? But I'm just curious how you found an effective way to kind of help that message land. Because I've advised a couple folks with that, like, think about obviously this deal, this company, but don't forget this is not probably your last deal in your life. And so, and some folks take that and sort of run with it, and other folks, doesn't even go through an ear. Just curious on kind of your experience.
Yeah, I think it's the same. Is some people can integrate that a bit, and some can. I mean, I have 2 adult children, and I have coached them about don't worry as much, right? It seems like this is the most critical thing that's ever going to happen, but it's not.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add on to that is that, when it's all said and done, first time founders don't know what they don't know until they get punched in the face, right? And in second and third and fourth and fifth time founders, if you're 6th time founders, if you're a Dan, right? And they know the barrel of complexity that they're about to go down in this journey. And they're humbled by it and understand that they need help and mentors and resources along the way to build the everlasting company that they hope to build. And Dan, you talked about, a few minutes ago about how you used to dream up things, right, in your engineering company. And I'm going to ask you to dream a little bit with us on the podcast today, and talk about your dream EIR role. You've had a bunch of them, right? But if Dan had a choice to pick the one that he wanted at the organization that he wanted, where would Dan go? What would be the dream EIR role?
Well, I think you know the answer to that, but I'll tell you anyway. for everyone's benefit. I had several years ago, I had some deep discussions with the secretary of the Smithsonian and the chief financial officer about being an EIR for the Smithsonian. Institution, which is an amazing organization. Most people only sort of know about the museums, but it's a far-flung entity with, astrobiology and media companies and all kinds of other stuff. So it's an incredible amalgamation of different enterprises. So I'd been coaching actually the director of exhibits, the head person for all the exhibits for all the museums, for a couple of years, and that's how I got into the castle, as it were, to see the secretary. But that didn't work out, unfortunately. But that would have been great, and that was kind of my ideal gig. Then the other one is kind of weird, but there's a F-16 squadron that protects the Capitol in D.C. called the Capitol Guardians. And when I was at Norfolk, the vice president that I reported to was the honorary commander. And that's kind of an EIR role. It's sort of an advisor, community liaison kind of person that can teach the squadron something or, bring them new ideas from outside their bubble. And I was on deck to be that honorary commander. And they take you up in an F-16 trainer and let you fly it for about 15 minutes. And I'm a big fan of flying jets.
Wow.
I've co-piloted a few private jets and stuff. So I was really excited about that. But it didn't work out. The actual commander retired. So I didn't get to follow my vice president's seat.
Dan, you're in the aviation too. We have so much more in common than I thought. We're going to geek out one day on planes, and engines, and everything else. Okay, fair enough. That's really cool. You just taught me something, by the way. So for everybody's benefit, I did not know about the Capitol Guardians. So that's what this podcast is for, knowledge and to learn different things. So thank you for sharing that, Dan. And who knows, they might listen to the podcast and go, hey, we have some things over here for you to do, if you're open.
It's amazing how things like that sometimes come around. I'm curious, actually, just to kind of pull on the thread a little bit. So Dream EIR roles, love those. First of all, I didn't know about the Capitol Guardians either. How do you see kind of the EIR role, kind of transforming or translating or whatnot, developing over time? Before it was sort of an interesting, university role, things like that. But how do you see this developing, kind of in the future going forward, especially with sort of all of the different at-bats or so that you've had in that role?
I think it's important to think about the trajectory of the role from original VC-based EIRs, where somebody would cash out of a portfolio company at VC, and the VC would then keep them sort of in-house, let them mentor other portfolio CEOs, and then maybe slot them into a company that needed a more experienced one as the company matured. And then the universities picked it up, and then government. So there are, government agencies that have, including Department of State, that have EIRs in them. So I think that the areas that I have not seen a lot of EIR penetration into have been sort of mid-tier companies. And then recently I thought about private schools. My wife just retired after 25 years at a private school. And, they need to think like businesses in order to survive in a economy where less and less people are willing to spend the kind of money that it takes to put a kid through private school. So I think, an EIR role there would help them think about revenue and alternate opportunities in different ways.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great to kind of think about.
It is. And, Dan, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about all the things that you've done. I learned a ton every time I talk to you. It feels like I can talk to you for 3 hours. The one thing that I love to ask people, because we're, as humans, we work, in the world that we work in, we also have personal lives and all the other things. We're layered people. I'm wondering if you can tell us something about yourself, Dan, that isn't on your resume, that I just can't find on LinkedIn, like the aviation thing, or other things that you might. What is something that we can't find on your resume, Dan, that you like to share with people?
I used to blow glass, and I was taught beginning glass blowing at the National Park called Glen Echo. And my hobby is cutting up trees. I have a sort of industrial sawmill. And I just, my wife asked me many years ago for a live edge dining room table, which she still hasn't gotten because I sort of fell in love with the process of cutting trees up into lumber and slabs.
Fair.
So I now have rented a number of my neighbors' garages to keep all of the slabs in, since I apparently like to do the cutting more than I do the making.
Okay. That is a really cool hobby. I got a chance to see glass blowing in Denver, and I was fascinated. I was like, whoa, this guy, I thought the guy was going to burn himself or something. I didn't know what was going to happen, but it was just a fascinating process to see people do glass blowing. So to know that that's something that you did and sawing trees, I would have never got that, Dan, wood and everything else. That's really cool. It sounds like a really good hobby, but I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on that. So I'm gonna let you.
Tinkering is a good thing. The rabbit hole we could go down that's maybe a little bit more relevant is what are you tinkering on and kind of working on recently? You kind of mentioned climate tech earlier in your intro. It would be awesome to spend a few minutes talking about what have you been kind of working on more recently and excited about, and kind of learning more about how you're using all your experience and background in your current work.
Yeah, so I mentor climate tech startups for a number of incubators around the world, and for NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I've been an entrepreneur in residence for them for more than 5 years, I think. And I've been helping those companies. And now these are not all climate tech, but I'm now up to 230 companies I think I've mentored, advised, or consulted for.
Wow.
But over the last 5 or 6 years, it's been purely climate tech companies. And in helping them raise funds and prep for pitching and setting up their operations, doing hiring, thinking about project management, all that stuff, I realized about 3 years ago that I should be investing in them myself. So I started something called Sandy Spring Climate Partners, and we invest in deep tech climate companies. So 90% of those are PhD first-time entrepreneur founders. So that's kind of become my specialty is, scientists transitioning into entrepreneurship roles, because there's a sort of special mindset shift that has to happen, and some special thoughts about how you hire and staff to be successful that are a little more challenging for scientists than for business people. And I've been very, very fortunate to work with some fantastically smart and, emotionally intelligent, very advanced CEOs. And I think that's interesting to me anyway, because, 30 years ago, the faculty that I would deal with at universities who were commercializing were, pretty, on the whole, fairly egocentric. I heard a lot of stuff like, if you were smart, you'd be a scientist like me. Business is easy. I could read a book and do what you do. Most of those guys didn't make it. But, and that was in part because academics as a whole viewed commercialization in business as defiling the ivory tower. And that has gone away. Right now, the folks that I work with are typically, in their early 30s, and they have grown up in a world where commercialization makes sense because it brings the creation of knowledge to benefit the greater good, to benefit humanity through commercialization. And that's a beautiful thing, and it makes sense to them that it's not dirty. Business is not evil. So that's it's been a really interesting transition to watch in the culture of academia.
Yeah, and it's I benefited from spending the first chapter of my career in academia, and I did it a little later than you, at least on the first kind of encounter. And so a lot of the things I was exposed to were things like ICOR and NSF, also looking at how can you help faculty and academics at least communicate, if not commercialize, right? And so. I'm not sure that I'm in full agreement that it's completely gone from the academy. Some of the things that you've described, but I think what's happened is it's created a whole, kind of pocket and group of people that are excited about commercializing, communicating, and definitely a more approachable and considerate move. But yeah, in my experience on the climate tech side, as you think about these folks kind of going later stage, there's all kinds of other things that you have to do when you deliver, what I call heavy metal companies, ultimately when folks put things that are metal in the ground, that, it's amazing to watch these folks that kind of matriculate out of academia, ultimately start to understand, what are some of the things that we have to do, but how their companies kind of evolve as they, prove their technology through pilot, and ultimately have to go do an integrated demonstration on site, and then start to talk about and think about project finance and institutional capital and bankability and, many of the things engineers don't really as a normal role think about. And it's such a, symphony, such a multidisciplinary engagement. It's interesting to sort of see how that evolves. And I am a little bit, kind of encouraged that folks are learning to translate and spending a little bit of time in different camps, and I think ultimately that enables us to do some really interesting things. I guess maybe to pull on the kind of your current work thread, hopefully what we're, trying to do through the podcast is connect kind of the network of EIRs together. And so, one of my favorite startup questions is always, what can we do to help? But hopefully, with kind of the podcast and some of the work that we're doing in reaching out to EIRs, we can, make that sort of an EIR network concept.
Absolutely.
So maybe what can, as we kind of build the EIR network, what can that network help or do to help kind of what you're working on?
Yeah, well, I think it's being able to make a warm introduction into corporates that might need something that some of these portfolio companies that I either mentor or invest in are producing. And we have companies that are energy storage, carbon capture and conversion, material science, biomaterials, bioplastics, some other things like that. So, so those introductions are really valuable and often hard to find through LinkedIn. So it'd be great to be able to have that network that I could tap into there. And then, always looking for folks interested in, accredited investors interested in the in helping with the climate emergency.
That's really good to know, Dan. And I think that the last thing we want to know is, how can these people connect with you, right? How can our listeners follow you, connect with you, reach out if they want to sort of get to know you, have an intro call, and try to build that relationship?
Yeah, LinkedIn is one way.
Okay.
And the other is through Sandy Spring Climate Partners, which is ssclimatepartners.com. Okay.
Dan, it's been an honor and privilege to have you on the show. Man, I might have to bring you back for a part two. We're going to have to bring you back for a part two, because I want to hear about, once you have your feet planted at MIT, the things you're working on there and the other things that you're seeing in the deep tech world, working with climate startups, which I think is truly a way we can deploy impact at scale in the world, working with climate companies. So thank you for the work that you do there. Thank you for joining us. It's been a privilege.
Thank you, guys. It's been a great pleasure. And whenever I talk to you guys, I feel like I'm in the bosom of brothers at arms in entrepreneurship and EIR hood.
That's right. But there you have it.
Awesome. Always a great time.
Thanks for joining us on EIR Live. We hope today's episode offered you valuable insights into the entrepreneurial journey. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and check out the description for more details. Do you have questions or suggestions? Please reach out to us. Connect with us on social media. We really value your input. Catch us next time for more inspiring stories and strategies. Keep pushing boundaries and making your mark on the world. I'm Terrence with my co-host Ilya Tabakh, signing off. Let's keep building.